First of all, man, it's good to see you again. It's been a minute, and thank you for making time to come on the show.
Likewise, Eric. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So I'm sure you get asked this question all the time, but I think that it's important to make sure that we have first defined key terms before we dive into a very long discussion of the implications of the usage and implementation of the philosophy behind those terms. So what is Zionism? Both theoretically, like what it's supposed to be, ostensibly, and then practically, like how it's actually played out.
Zionism is a political ideology which called for a Jewish state in Palestine. Of course, Zionism was also a movement. There was a Zionist movement which began in the late 1870s among Eastern European Jews in places like the Pale settlement of Russia. It picked up in the 1880s and 1890s with the pogroms in Eastern Europe. And then you could say when Theodor Herzl penned the Jewish state, calling for the establishment of a Jewish state in perhaps Argentina, perhaps Palestine, he didn't seem to be too interested in the exact location. You could say that is when the Zionist movement really took off. And already by World War I, you had 60,000 Jewish settlers living in Palestine. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, after the Balfour Declaration, in which the British government called for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, you get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of more Jews who migrate to Palestine. And then in 1948, the Zionist movement realized its ambition, and in May 1948, establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And you could say that was sort of the climax, the peak of the Zionist movement. And afterwards, Zionism really just became synonymous with the state of Israel. The Zionist movement succeeded. It established the state of Israel, and that was that. And that is, you could say, a very short history of Zionism, both at a theoretical level, but more importantly, at a practical level.
All right, thank you. So because the terms are conflated frequently, I think it's also important to make sure that we break down what is the distinction between being anti-Zionist and being anti-Semitic.
Well, as we said, Zionism is a political ideology that dates to the late 19th century. Judaism is a religious ideology that dates to the ancient world. We're talking 3,300 years ago. So Jews have lived in virtually every country in the world. They're bound by a set of religious texts and religious practices and religious traditions, right? They're bound by the five books of Moses, the Torah, and the Talmud, and the Mishnah, and as well as the laws stipulated by those books, the 613 commandments, the covenant that God gave to Moses on Mount Sinai, the long tradition of wrapping tefillin and of celebrating Shabbat and of keeping kosher, right? These are the things that bind Jews across the world, rather than a shared culture or a shared history or a shared ancestry. Obviously, Jews don't share genetic characteristics. You have brown Jews and black Jews and white Jews and Latin Jews. I mean, Jews come in all different colors, and that's because you can convert to Judaism. And in fact, there were many mass conversion events in Jewish history. And so the Jews are a religious group who share a religious tradition. The Zionists are a political group who share a political ideology. And that's why you could be a Jewish Zionist, you could be a Jewish anti-Zionist, you could be a non-Jewish Zionist, you could be a non-Jewish anti-Zionist. In fact, if you want to correlate them, if you want to associate these two ideologies, if you force me to, I would say you are much more likely to be an anti-Semite if you were a Zionist over the course of the past 140 years than you were likely to be a Zionist if you were an anti-racist, right? Because the Zionists embrace the same kind of racialized ideology. They said Jews are a race, they're a nation, they're a people, and then they adopted the same worldview that the anti-Semites adopted. I mean, it was an outgrowth of anti-Semitism. They said, oh, wait, well, if we can't be Europeans, if we can't be French, if we can't be German, well, then, well, what are we? Our race is Jewish. They embrace, they internalize that racialized thinking associated with the anti-Semites, and then, of course, eventually the Nazis, which led them to say, no, Jews are a race, exactly like the Nazis said, Jews are a race. Well, that's a very short, a very concise summary of the difference between Judaism and Zionism.
So let's get into a bit into deconstructing the apologist perspective on this, both for the state of Israel and Zionism more generally. I mean, there will be some, in fact, I mean, it's a pretty consistent talking point that, look, you can't separate these things out quite that easily. Like Zionism is the mechanism for safeguarding, the preeminent mechanism for safeguarding Jewish identity and from against very real and very recent existential threats. And that, just to underscore the point, what do you say to the commonly used talking point that Israel is the only Jewish state? So if you oppose that Jewish state or its practices, you are inherently anti-Semitic for doing so.
Right. That's certainly what Zionists want you to believe. The Zionist movement has been trying to convince the world for the past 140 years that a Jew and a Zionist are the same thing, right? That if you are a Jew, you therefore are inherently a Zionist. There are many problems with this. Of course, the first and foremost of which is that for at least half of the history of Zionism, let's say from the 1870s until the end of the 1930s, if not well into the 1940s, in the case of Jews in many Middle Eastern countries, Arab and Muslim countries, but for at least half of the history of the Zionist movement, most Jews around the world were hostile to Zionism. So how could it be that a Zionist is a Jew if most Jews are non or anti-Zionists? It just doesn't even make any sense, right? This idea that Israel is somehow safeguarding the interests of the Jews, or that the Zionist movement was somehow protecting the Jews, rescuing Jews from persecution, this is a myth. And it's a myth easily debunked by anyone who understands the history of the Zionist movement. From the 1880s until 1914, Arthur Rupin and Menachem Shenkin were the Zionist officials in Jaffa in charge of Zionist immigration policy. They made the decisions about which Zionists from Eastern Europe could migrate to Palestine, could settle in one of these agricultural colonies in Palestine, and could get benefits from the Zionist movement in Palestine. It was a very organized policy that had criteria. What kind of Jews were welcome in Palestine? Which kind of Jews were unwelcome in Palestine?
Can I pause you for a second there? Because I think that that's really important to underscore, because right now, the way that the way that I understand Aliyah, migration to Israel, like the right of return, so to speak, is that all Jews, no matter what, like are welcome to claim citizenship in Israel. And you're saying that, like, actually back in the early days, before the state of Israel existed, it was much more selective.
That's exactly right.
Why?
Well, because the goal of the Zionist movement, as we already said, was to establish a Jewish state in a land, Palestine, that was 95% non-Jewish. And the Zionists understood very well that in order to establish a Jewish state in a country of overwhelmingly non-Jews, a country of overwhelmingly Palestinian Arabs who had a strong connection to the country, who had lived there for generations, centuries, indeed millennia, who had a proud identity, who called themselves Palestinians, who called their country Palestine, who spoke Arabic and wore Arab dress and ate Arab food and identified strongly with Palestine. So the Zionist movement understood that those people did not want to live under Jewish supremacist rule. They did not want to live under the rule of a country that considered the state Jewish, and that a country whose mission was to serve Jews, not Palestinian Arabs. So, of course, the Zionist movement understood this very, very well, and they understood that the Arabs were going to be hostile to the project of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine. And so they understood from the beginning that they needed to establish a militia. They established the militia, I believe, already in 1903, basically a watch, these militias that would be watching over these Jewish agricultural colonies. You already had violence between Jews and Palestinians in Palestine in the 1880s. They understood their presence was unwelcome. They understood this from the very beginning. And so if your presence is unwelcome, if your goal is to create a Jewish state and control all of the non-Jews and subject all the non-Jews to the laws and the ordinances and the principles and the flag of the Jewish state, well, you're going to encounter resistance. And so what do? So you build a militia. And how do you, and it's not just building a militia, right? The goal of the Zionist movement was to attract wealthy, single professionals, not just any professional.
So this is why it was selective, instead of just trying to flood. Because, one question would be, okay, well, then just flood Palestine with as many willing bodies as possible. Why not take that approach?
Well, because they understood that if they were to ship all of these needy Jews who had lots of dependents, who were poor, who were impoverished, who didn't bring any assets with them or any wealth with them, and they just needed help and medical care, and they needed assistance and rations, right? If they were needy, they would be a burden on the community. And so the Zionist movement from 1880 until 1914 rejected a majority of the Zionist immigrants that wanted to move to Palestine. And the number one reason for that rejection was destitution. 61% of those rejected were rejected because they were too poor.
This
And
is
then,
social engineering, bro. Like there's some. I mean, can anybody see like the eugenicist kind of strains in this thinking?
well, that's a great point that you make. Where do you think Arthur Rupin and Menachem Shekin were born and raised? They were born and raised in Europe, in Germany. I mean, Arthur Rupin comes from an area of Poland called Poznan, and at the time, the German government was trying to transform the demography of this part of Poland called Poznan. They wanted, or maybe it was actually Eastern Prussia, I believe. They wanted to transform the demography of this area that Arthur Rupin was from Polish to German. They wanted to demographically engineer this area of Prussia. I mean, this was, and so where do you think Arthur Rupin got this idea from? In fact, he even hired a German colonization official to join the Jewish agency and help them demographically engineer Palestine. They wanted to transform Palestine, obviously from a majority Arab country to a majority Jewish country, and they realized the German demographic engineers would be perfect to hire for that purpose. And so even after the Balfour Declaration, even after, they have great power backing. And the British movement in the Balfour Declaration called for the establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine and is going to facilitate Jewish immigration and facilitate Jewish land purchases. Even despite the great power backing, the Zionist movement took the exact same approach after 1917. And in fact, you have Chaim Weizmann in 1919, who says to the Ukrainian refugees who had suffered from pogroms and persecution, you had hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Jews in 1918 and 1919. They were slaughtered in mass. Hundreds of thousands became refugees, homeless, impoverished, persecuted. Many of them actually wanted to move to Palestine, but Chaim Weizmann said, "We can't help you. This is not a movement trying to save Jews from persecution. No, we want wealthy Jews, not poor Jews. We want single Jews, not Jews with lots of kids. We want self-sufficient Jews who are strong and muscular and can join an armed force, because we're going to have to eventually deal with this native population. And how do you think we're going to deal with them? By writing op-eds in the newspaper telling them Zionism is in their interest? No, we're going to deal with them through force." And
We
that's
need
what
Ubermensch.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Like we need an Ubermensch in a sense, right?
We need to build. I mean, you have to remember, the Zionists, they position themselves in opposition to these more traditional Jews who preferred to study Torah, who were more passive, politically passive. They didn't want to get involved in politics. They were against violence. They didn't like war. They wanted to be left to their own, to study Torah, and they were anti-statist. I mean, for 2,000 years, Jews lived around the world, subject to the whimsical decisions of leaders and emperors and autocrats. And so they developed this sort of anti-statist, anti-violence approach. We're just going to keep to ourselves. That was, if you had to paint broad strokes and try and summarize 2,000 years of Jewish history, that is how I would characterize it. And the Zionists hated that about Jews. They hated that about Jewish culture. They said, no, we're going to be strong Jews, muscular Jews, and we're going to toil the soil ourselves. And so the attitude was almost a kind of hostility towards a weak Jew, in the same exact hostility that the anti-Semites held towards those weak Jews who were diseased and had syphilis and had epilepsy. The Zionists internalized that anti-Semitism. And that's why you had many Zionist leaders, Zev Jabotinsky, Arthur Rupin was among them, who spewed out some of the most anti-Semitic stuff you could possibly imagine. Max Nordau, who was kind of Theodor Herzl's right-hand man. He was one of the organizers of the First Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. If you look at his writings in the 1880s, you'd think he was a raging anti-Semite, because the way he talks about Jews in his writings, he wrote fiction and he wrote plays, he was a playwright, and the way he describes Jews, you're like, my God, this guy's a raging anti-Semite. They're always diseased. They're weak. They have, they need. This was the attitude of the Zionist movement towards the Jews, and they internalized that, and that's one of the reasons they rejected all these, impoverished, weak Jews seeking fleeing persecution, seeking refuge in the land of Palestine.
So let's get into. I mean, you've done an excellent job of unpacking that, and I can also see how we could continue to unpack that for like another hour, man.
We could keep going, right? Because the story doesn't end in 1919 with Chaim Weizmann's comments, right? In fact, throughout the 1920s, the policy of the Yishuv, the Jewish community in Palestine, was to deport diseased, sick Jews from the Yishuv, send them back to Europe. Because it's like, here we are trying to build a Jewish state in a land of overwhelming non-Jews. So we need to focus on that. We need to focus on institution building, right? Building institutions of a state, a military. We need to focus on building a labor union. We need to focus, on building a political organization. And of course, these sick, weak Jews are getting in the way. They're bogging us down. They're consuming our resources. Send them back to Europe.
So where are the British mandate principles when all of this is taking place? Where is Balfour when this is taking place? I mean, from what I understand, like Christian Zionists, like preeminent Christian Zionist figures of that time, like Balfour, I mean, some people are surprised to find out that these people were not only white supremacists, but also anti-Semitic themselves. And it was just, look, once you understand that Zionism was a plan for depopulating Europe of its Jewish population, then you do start to get where this cynicism, this cynical approach to Christianity and Zionism come from. So where was Balfour? Where were the other non-Jewish Zionist European voices while all this was taking place? Because they would have had the key role in deciding, okay, who does get to immigrate to Mandate Palestine, right?
Well, that's a great question. Recall that Arthur Balfour in 1905, when he was Prime Minister of Britain, more than a decade before he authored the infamous Balfour Declaration, he sponsored legislation called the Aliens Act to keep Jews out of Britain at a time when they were being slaughtered in the masses in Eastern Europe in pogroms. I say he didn't want Jews to come to Britain. He was an anti-Semite. And that's also why he called for a Jewish state in Palestine, because that would rid Europe of its Jews. That would solve the Jewish problem, quote unquote. And he believed it was a problem, right? That there were Jews in Europe was a problem for him. That's why he supported Zionism. But of course, the leaders, the British leaders who were in charge of British mandatory policy were basically aligned with the Zionist view towards immigration, right? So Chaim Weizmann was an extremely influential you could call him almost as a Zionist lobbyist. He was really the leader of the Zionist movement in London, and he was actively lobbying the British government. And whatever the Zionist movement desired, the British officials more or less agreed. They were more or less aligned with the approach. Remember, the British government also doesn't want needy Jews moving to Palestine. That's not going to make it easier for them to at least in their own perception, that's not going to make it easy for them to keep peace and keep quiet in Palestine. That'll create burdens on the community. In fact, the British were all about trying to use the resources of the country. They were trying to exploit the resources of the country for the benefit of the mandatory government, so that the motherland didn't need to send resources, send money, send troops to Palestine. No, the idea was the mandatory government would be able to recruit police officers from the native population, would be able to extract resources, tax the local population such that it would be entirely self-sufficient and not require any assistance from the motherland. And that was the approach. So, of course, the British were aligned with the Zionist view of keeping needy, impoverished, sick, and diseased Jews out of Palestine.
So I realize that this next question is going to probably require us to take a few decades or more, like step back in the timeline here. You alluded to it already in one of your first answers, but where did Jewish opposition to Zionism begin? And I mean that both geographically, because you mentioned what I think would be characterized as like the Mizrahi Jewish community, like the so-called Eastern Jewish community or Arab Jews, right?
Yeah.
But also, from what I understand, there's always been, like, even amongst the Ashkenazi community in Europe, where Zionism in its modern form was given birth to, like there has been opposition right there as well historically. So where did the major currents of Jewish opposition to Zionism begin, both geographically and from an organizational ideological standpoint? Meaning, was this opposition rooted in secularism or within religious movements or both? Were they in dialogue with one another? That's a very convoluted question, but tackle it however you want.
There were four major groups of Jews between the years 1880 and, let's call it, 1948. And all four of those groups, for the majority of that period, really well into the 1940s, opposed Zionism, or at least you could say were on average non-Zionist or even anti-Zionist. Those four groups would be Jews in Western Europe and the United States. Let's bundle those two groups of Jews together because I think they had similar views on a lot of things. That's, Jews in the United States, you're talking 4 million Jews. So this is like the largest community of Jews in the world by the 1920s and 30s. Then you had about alongside obviously Jews in Eastern Europe, because you still had many, many millions of Jews living in the Russian Empire and the Pale settlement in the Russian Empire, and also places around Eastern Europe, like the Balkans, like Yugoslavia, like Czechoslovakia, like the Baltic states, obviously Romania, Bulgaria. These areas have huge Jewish populations. So you have Jews in Eastern Europe, Jews in Western Europe and the United States. Then you have Jews in Arab and Muslim countries, almost 1 million. The largest communities of which are places like Morocco, places like Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya. You have Jews all around the Arab and Muslim worlds. Turkey, Iran, obviously. And then the fourth group, the fourth category, I would say, is ultra-Orthodox Jews, who were, for the most part, in Eastern Europe, but are also spread around Western Europe and the United States. Now, starting with the ultra-Orthodox Jews, were overwhelmingly anti-Zionist well beyond 1948 for religious reasons. They saw the Zionists as secularists, as embracing secular ideologies like nationalism, which has nothing to do with Judaism. The Zionists said, you don't need to keep Shabbat, you don't need to pray, you don't need to believe in God, you just need to move to Palestine. So they were heretics in the sense that they were leading Jews astray. And then on top of that, Zionism violates many religious laws, especially the Jewish thinking around the end of days, in which it's God who's going to decide when the end of days come and when the Jews eventually return, quote unquote, to the promised land. And any human action taken before that happens is considered a heresy. And that's why the Neturei Karta, that's why the Satmar Hasidim, that's why the Eidas Charedis in Jerusalem, that's why many ultra-Orthodox sects reject Zionism for that reason. So that's the ultra-Orthodox. Among the Jews in Western Europe and the United States, the reason they oppose Zionism for the most part was because they saw it as a threat to their ability to integrate into their own societies. American Jews are trying to become American, and they're facing obstacles in their attempt to assimilate into American society because at first they're not considered white. So they want to they want to integrate into British society, French society, German society, American society, but they can't. And they're worried that this movement calling for all Jews around the world to move to Palestine, claiming this is a Jewish movement and it represents all Jews, and that all Jews belong in Palestine, that would obviously be a threat to their status and their ability to integrate in their home countries. And that's why the vast majority of German, French, British, and American Jews were hostile to Zionism well into the 1930s and in many cases well into the 1940s. And then you had, of course, the Arab and Muslim Jews who, again, were totally uninterested in Zionism. I mean, you could say Zionism didn't even register to most of these Jews until the 1930s, if not the 1940s and beyond. And the reason is because they were, again, we're painting a broad stroke here because you have Jews, again, spread out across 22 countries. But on average, you could say they were relatively well integrated. They did not face major systematic discrimination and violence as did the Jews in Eastern Europe. There was no concept of a pogrom in every few years or few months in which Jews in Morocco or Egypt or Libya or Iraq would be attacked. That just wasn't a thing in the Arab and Muslim worlds from the 1880s to the 1930s. In Iraq, 35% of Baghdad was Jewish in the 1920s and 30s. They held high positions in society. They were respected and well integrated. And so they saw the Zionist movement as a threat to their status in their own home countries for obvious reasons. Here, the Zionists were trying to transform an Arab Muslim country into a Jewish country. And here you had all these Jews living in Arab and Muslim countries worried that a movement of Jews to try and transform another Arab and Muslim country into a Jewish country would threaten them in their own home countries. And they were unfortunately correct about that. And that's and these Jews were extremely prescient. They predicted correctly that the Zionist movement would lead to blowback, would lead to blowback in their own societies. Here you had the Jews telling the world. Here you had the Zionists in Palestine telling the world, the Jews of Algeria, the Jews of Yemen and Iraq, you guys don't belong in Iraq. You don't belong in Yemen. And they tried to convince those countries and those governments and those societies that the Jews didn't belong there. And lo and behold, they succeeded in convincing them that the Jews did not belong there. And ultimately, you get all this anti-Jewish violence, and you get anti-Jewish laws passed in all these countries. And in fact, you actually have Zionists also triggering and instigating false flag operations in many countries like Egypt and Iraq to try and scare the Jews into leaving and coming to Palestine. And so for all of these reasons, you could say the average Jew in Western Europe, the average Orthodox Jew, the average Jew in Eastern Europe, the average American Jew, and the average Arab or Muslim Jew was anti-Zionist or non-Zionist well into the late 30s and 40s. And if I could just make one last point, which I forgot to mention, which is actually the most popular party in all of Eastern Europe. We didn't really mention Eastern European Jews. Like we said, there are about 4 million. The most popular party was the Bund party. This was a socialist party. It was an anti-Zionist party. The whole idea of the Bund movement, which attracted by far more Jews in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in the Pale settlement, than did the Zionist movement. Their whole idea was, no, we're going to stay put. We're going to fight anti-Semitism where we are. We're going to call for workers' rights and child and better labor laws and free child healthcare, free healthcare and free and child child labor laws. And I mean, if you look at the Bundist movement, I mean, they fought for equal rights in their own home countries. And so they saw the Zionists who said, forget about Poland, move to Palestine as a threat to their movement's goals.
I mean, I would say, and I would imagine that it's also just counter to basic leftist principles to be supporting an ethno-state based on settler colonialism as well, right? Like, what does that bode for the notion of global solidarity and anti-imperialism? Right?
That's exactly correct. You had socialists, Jewish, British socialists in the UK saying Zionism is an imperial movement, because of course the socialists saw imperialism and colonialism as partners to capitalism, and thus they believed that the Zionist movement was an extension of British imperialism. I mean, it was, right? I mean, the British were sponsoring the whole Zionist project. So it was an extension of imperialism. And you had many anti-imperialists and many socialists and communists attack the Zionist movement for that reason as well. That's a great point.
So why did the Zionists win? And when I say win, what I mean is ultimately, obviously, Palestine was ethnically cleansed and became what we now have as the state of Israel, so-called.
Well, the Zionists won for a few reasons. Number one, the Nazis annihilated many of the anti-Zionists. I mean, like we said, the Bundists, who were by far the most popular party in Poland, they won 55% of the Jewish vote in 1938, 1939. It's on the eve of the Holocaust and of World War II. The anti-Zionist socialists were still by far the most popular party in Eastern Europe. And what happened in 1939 through 1945 is that those Jews were annihilated. They were sent off to gas chambers and slaughtered. So on the one hand, you had the actual physical annihilation of the Jewish anti-Zionists and non-Zionists. And then, of course, you had, in places like the United States, you had a gradual shift from anti-Zionism to non-Zionism to Zionism. As the Nazis were shipping Jews off to the gas chambers, the Jews of America increasingly began to embrace the goals of the Zionist movement, famously in 1942 in the Biltmore platform in the United States, where they basically said the goal of the Zionist movement is to establish a Jewish state. And many, if not most American Jews by that point, by the mid to late 1940s, were increasingly embracing the Zionist movement's goals out of their belief that this could save Jews, or this could rescue Jews from persecution. And then which by the way was in many cases untrue. If I could just share one or two anecdotes. After the war, in 1945, you had hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees living in displacement camps around Europe, in Austria and Germany and Italy. And there were many attempts by British and French Jews to try and rescue those Jews and bring them to Britain. You had one attempt in late summer 1945 to bring a few thousand Jewish children from these DP camps who were orphans. They had no families. They were living in squalid conditions. There was no heating in the camps. They were all developing frostbite. Right? These kids were living in absolutely awful conditions. And so you had these rescue efforts, these British Jewish organizations, these French Jewish organizations, trying to bring these kids, settle them in homes, settle them in synagogues where they would have a much better treatment, access to doctors, heating in the winter. And what did the Zionist movement do? Ben Gurion travels from Palestine. He travels to Germany and Austria in 1945, and he collaborates with the committee leaders of these DP camps, who were mostly Zionists and increasingly Zionists. He compels them to forbid any Jews from leaving the DP camps unless they come to Israel. So unless they come to Palestine, right? So it's either they come to Palestine or they linger and suffer and even die in the DP camps. So this idea that Zionism is about rescuing Jews from persecution is just a fiction. Zionism was about ensuring those Jews wind up in Israel and Palestine. They needed the bodies to wage a demographic war and to wage a kinetic war. As we said, they knew they would need to establish a fierce fighting force. And throughout the 1940s, they're expanding the Haganah, the Jewish defense forces in Palestine. They're actually in the camps recruiting Holocaust survivors to join the Jewish militias in Palestine. And then in 1947, after the partition plan and after the outbreak of violence in Palestine, in late 1947, what does the Haganah do? They go around the DP camps and they institute a mandatory conscription among Jews in the camps ages 18 to 35. Here, you just survived the Holocaust. Here's a gun. Now go carry out ethnic cleansing in Palestine by force. And you had many Jews in the camps who had no interest in fighting. These people just survived 6 years of war, and now you're sending them into another war?
I have a follow-up question with this too, and that is that was there still this social engineering project going on in the selection process of who Zionists would allow to migrate from the concentration camps?
It's a
from
fantastic
the DP camps, I should say, which
That's
means
great-
IDP, internally displaced peoples, for the audience.
Yeah, that's a great question. So by the late 1940s, the Zionist movement took a different attitude. In the early decades, the key goal was kind of community through strength. It was in the 1920s, the population is 85% Palestinian Arab. The Jews understand they're not establishing. There's no number of Jews could arrive in Palestine in the coming years for them to actually be able to establish a Jewish state. And they're all very, very well aware of that. In fact, they see the Zionist movement requiring decades before they're going to be able to establish a Jewish state. And that was kind of the internal thinking in the 1910s and 20s. So it was, let's build a slow movement. And the risk was total collapse and total failure, right? The main thing on the minds of the Zionist leaders in the 1920s was collapse. In 1926, more Jews left Palestine than came to Palestine, right? They were worried that actually the Jewish community, the population of Jews in Palestine would actually decline. And so they were worried on just survival. They weren't so much worried about, we need 500,000 Jews to move to Palestine in the next few years. No. But by the late 40s, especially after the end of the war, especially by 1947, it's very clear the British are planning on leaving Palestine, right? The British are winding down their empire everywhere on the world, and Palestine is no exception. And so by that point, the Zionists understand that, the day of reckoning is coming soon. And that the war for Palestine is going to happen soon. They all understood that. By the late 40s, 46, 47, 48, the Haganah no longer is training its soldiers in self-defense. It's all about offensive maneuvering, military command and control. They're spying on Arab villages and gathering explicitly military information on every Palestinian village in Palestine by 1946 and 1947. They understand that a war is coming, and that they're going to need to fight the Arab population, and that they're going to need to establish a Jewish state in the near future, and so they need bodies. And even sick bodies, diseased bodies, they still rejected many Jews who were sick and diseased. But they loosened things because they needed the numbers. But still, even well into the late 40s and early 50s, you have Zionist officials. For example, one Zionist official in 1950 is bragging about, we rejected 500 Jews from Tunisia, we rejected 300 Jews from Germany, because they were diseased and they were sick. You have one family in 1950 or 1951 from Morocco, and they're trying to move to Palestine, and they get to I guess they arrive at the airport in Morocco, and the Zionist envoy says, you can't take these two kids with you because they're diseased. And the family is forced between moving to Palestine without their kids or staying behind. So the policy, the eugenicist policy, continues even as late as 1956, 1957. You have Golda Meir, who was then foreign minister of Israel, in which she tells these documents were actually recently revealed, and there's a Haaretz article about this. You can read about this. They were you had Golda Meir writing letters to the Polish foreign ministry saying, please don't send us sick and diseased Jews. We don't want them. So this was an attitude of the Zionist movement going well into the late 50s. This idea of only desiring the cream of the crop, even to this day, right? If you had access to the internal meetings of the Israeli foreign ministry, what you would learn is that they're obsessed with getting Jews from rich countries. Right? They want Jews from America and France and Germany and England. They don't want Jews from, like Argentinian impoverished Jews who are fleeing hyperinflation. They don't want those Jews. They want rich Jews. It's the same basic underlying philosophy.
And I also see so many dramatic parallels to events playing out currently in the U.S. under the Trump, but frankly, the Biden administration too. And that is, you just alluded to family separation, right? But this imposed like within a community, like on its own people, right? That's what we are now seeing, and what we've seen like going back almost a decade. That's family separation. This is something that like right-minded progressive people are supposed to be outraged by, and this is one of the founding principles, operational principles behind like creating the state of Israel. That should give anyone pause, right? And also, I don't know if I want to use the exact phrasing that Trump used a few years ago, but like he basically said, we don't want people from shithole countries, right? And you have Zionists saying the same thing about their own people in reference to the places that they would be escaping in order to create this state.
And that's the exact approach they take once they arrive in the country as well, right? We haven't even talked about that, but you have all these Jews coming from Europe. You have all these Jews coming from Arab and Muslim countries. And in some cases, for example, there was one case in which the Polish Jews coming from Eastern Europe the Zionist movement did not expect them to get visas because the Polish government was not issuing exit visas to many Jews. And so they promised all of these housing units, apartment buildings, to Jews coming from Arab and Muslim countries. And then when the Polish government reversed course and these Polish Jews were able to come to Israel, what did the Zionist movement do? It sent those Arab and Muslim Jews off to what were called ma'abarot, transit camps. I think a better phrase might be a concentration camp. It's literally a tent city that is enclosed by barbed wire, in which the Jews are not allowed to leave. And they're given meager rations, and there's no privacy, and there's overcrowding. They're concentration camps.
Another historical parallel in American history with the internment of Japanese American citizens, right?
And in fact, you had an Israeli Knesset member in the early 1950s visit these ma'abarot, as they were known in Hebrew, and he said, "This reminds me of the concentration camps that I spent time in the 1940s." He said it himself. So anyways, the attitude towards these Mizrahi Jews, these Jews from Eastern countries, was one of derision. Their culture was denigrated. They were told not to speak Arabic. They were placed in abysmal conditions. Their children were kidnapped. You have 50,000 Arab Jewish children that were 50,000. Arab, that's my understanding. That's an estimate. Obviously, we don't know the exact numbers, but many tens of thousands, and their babies were taken from them. Talk about eugenicism. It's like we don't want these people to be. We don't want their culture, and we don't want children from these Arab and Muslim countries to be raised in this environment, in this Arab environment, this backwards culture. That was the attitude of the Zionist movement.
We don't want race mixing, is what it sounds like. And I mean, to what extent was Zionism really always about? I mean, maybe we can say that things have shifted somewhat, since the establishment of the state, but to what extent was Zionism really always about not a Jewish state, but an Ashkenazi Jewish state?
Oh, I mean, you had Arthur Rupin, and who we've already talked about, and as well as Jabotinsky. They explicitly said, we don't want Ethiopian Jews moving to Palestine. Why? Because they're going to taint Jewish blood. In the early years, in the 1880s, there was a very small group of Yemeni Jews, who had migrated to Palestine, and they show up. There's maybe 500 of them. And what does the Zionist movement do? They force them to establish an encampment outside of the Jewish agricultural colonies. They wouldn't let them live in the Jewish agricultural colonies themselves. They had to live on the outside of it. Because
ghettoizing them.
Because they don't want those Yemeni Jews to taint the Ashkenazi Jewish blood. They don't want to mix with their backwards culture. I mean, that was the attitude of the Zionist movement from the origins. And I mean, if you look at the rank and file of the Israeli military establishment and the Israeli political establishment and the Israeli cultural and intellectual establishment, it's pretty much, I mean, even to this day, it's entirely dominated by Ashkenazi Jews. To this day, Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, their culture may be kind of glorified, and it kind of the same way hip-hop culture is maybe glorified in the United States. But when it comes to actual policies, and when it comes to poverty levels, when it comes to involvement in politics, and they're underrepresented in every facet and aspect of Israeli society.
So I'm going to take a very sharp jump forward on our timeline here. And I would love to have you back on the show to actually dive into, go into greater detail on some of this historical stuff. But let's jump forward to contemporary politics a bit. And I realize what we're skipping. We're skipping the Nakba. We're skipping Suez Crisis. We're skipping the 6-Day War. We're skipping Yom Kippur. We're skipping tons of history. And all of that deserves each of those things could easily justify their own episode or series. I don't want to make light of those things, but I do need to be mindful of time. So why are we seeing, I mean, we've talked a bit about what to some people might be surprising, like the currents of anti-Semitism in Christian Zionism, right? And also what you pointed out, currents of anti-Semitism within Jewish Zionism, right? And looking at the history might help us to better understand some of the really perplexing just imagery that we're seeing on the streets at some far right rallies, right? So why are we seeing historically anti-Semitic, white nationalist, white Christian nationalist movements waving the freaking Israeli flag? How are we supposed to make sense of this, man?
Well, it's a very good question. And the Zionists have been allied with the anti-Semites, as we already said, for more than a century. But taking the story to the present day, there continues to be ideological, strategic, and religious shared goals between Zionists and anti-Semites. Recall that Zionism is an ideology that says Jews are not a religion. Jews are a people, a nation, a race. They want you to believe that all Jews around the world have shared ancestry. We're all one big family, right? We all descended from the same great-great-great-great-great-grandfather and grandmother. That's what they want you to believe. You know who else believes in blood and soil and race? Nazis, anti-Semites, ethno-supremacists. They share the same thinking that nations are these ancient things and that they're based on blood and race and DNA. And so they have this same shared goal of creating pure ethno-racial states. I mean, that's what Bolsonaro wants to do in Brazil. That's what in Hungary.
Orban.
That's what Orban wants to do in Hungary. That's what the ethno-nationalists want to do in Spain. That's what the ethno-nationalists, Le Pen, that's what she's trying to do in France.
Basically pick a European country at this point. The far right is even in control in Sweden, man. It's crazy.
No matter where you look across Europe, and if you look at the right-wing parties, they're all about, they hate immigrants, they hate Muslims. You know who else hates immigrants and Muslims? Israel. You had all of these African migrants come to Israel, fleeing the wars in Somalia and Eritrea, fleeing mandatory conscription in Eritrea, and they wind up in Israel, and they're ghettoized, they're imprisoned, they're just the most discriminated against population, perhaps even more so than the Palestinian Arabs. I mean, I know this is hard to imagine, but the black migrants get the most police brutality. They face more police brutality, perhaps, than even Palestinians, just to get a sense of how racist Israeli society is. They hate immigrants, because they're of the wrong religio-ethnic category. They have the wrong color skin. And then Ethiopian Jews also face extreme racism by the police. And there have been many cases of Ethiopian Jews who have been brutalized and beaten by the Israeli police. Just look at how the Israeli police deal with those black Jewish immigrants. I mean, dramatically different treatment than they deal with the white Jewish immigrants. So it's the same attitude of a kind of a racial hierarchy that they both have, the Zionist movement and all of these far-right parties across Europe and the world have. Narendra Modi is another great example, right? He's a Hindu nationalist. I mean, replace Hindu with Jewish, and Narendra Modi and Bibi Netanyahu represent a very, very similar ideological trend. So again,
and they love selling weapons to each other too, right? Probably not a coincidence. Yeah.
Yes, India loves buying weapons from Israel. By the way, so does the Philippines. When Rodrigo Duterte, who's by the way now sitting in custody in The Hague for having killed and murdered 10,000, 15,000, we don't know the true number, but just extrajudicial assassinations of anyone who he thought was a gang member or part of the drug trafficking industry. He just slaughtered them all extrajudicially, which got him arrested by the ICC, where he's now sitting in The Hague on charges for mass murder. Now, I don't know his exact charges, but in any case, why do I bring him up? In 2019, he famously said, and this is public, you can find this quote. He said, the reason I love buying weapons from Israel is because they do not place any restrictions on the weapon sales. I mean, he said it directly. He said, I love buying weapons from Israel because I can slaughter whoever I want with them and not have to worry about the weapons spigot getting cut off. I mean, it's insane. So Israel, yes, they create military partnerships. They sell arms and weapons and spy tech to 140 countries in the world or something like that. And of course, but the original question you asked was, why do all these anti-Semites love Israel? Well, we already talked about their shared hatred of Muslims. We already talked about their shared kind of ethno-national supremacist ideas around race and nation. But then I think, as you correctly pointed out, there's also these shared strategic interests, right? If Israel can get away with it, well, then we should be able to get away with it too. Right? If Israel can expel its migrants and ethnically cleanse millions of Palestinians, well, then why shouldn't we be able to ethnically cleanse all those dirty brown and black migrants in our country?
So what would you say is the state of play now with respect to the organizing and the accumulated power of the anti-Zionist Jewish community in the U.S.? Do you see room for hope in the short term?
We are experiencing the most dramatic shift in Jewish attitudes towards the state of Israel that we've experienced in the entire history of the Zionist movement. There has never before been such a rapid change in public opinion among Jewish Americans in the entire history of the Zionist movement over the past, let's call it 2 years. JVP, on the eve of October 2023, had something like 34,000 emails on its email subscriber list. 4 months later, was it by January or February 2024, they had 10 times that number of emails, something close to 400,000. And that's already a year and a half ago. Okay? You have Jewish anti-Zionist congresses popping up in places like Vienna. You You had a Jewish anti-Zionist Congress organized by Cornell University. You have literally hundreds of Jewish anti-Zionist content creators, podcasters, Instagrammers. I could rattle off literally dozens and dozens of them. Overwhelmingly people not speaking about their anti-Zionism before October 7th. But now, how can they not? These are people creating content, political content. They're Jewish. And October 7th woke them up. Why did it wake them up? Because for the past 140 years, the Zionist movement has been a settler colonial project. Settler colonial projects, wherever they come about, are inevitably involve the annihilation of the native population. The whole point of a settler colonial movement is to replace a native population with a settler population. And this happened in the United States, it happened in Canada, it happened in Tanzania, it happened in New Zealand, it happened in Australia. It tried to happen in South Africa, right? It happened in Israel. So it happened in all these places. And in every single instance, with almost no exceptions, if not no exceptions, the settler community sought to replace, not to exploit, but to replace the indigenous population. Now, in a word, it's called genocide, right? And for 140 years, they were doing it slowly, right? They carried out a massive act of ethnic cleansing in 48. They continued to ethnically cleanse Palestinians in the 50s and 60s. They carried out another massive ethnic cleansing operation in 67. And then they continued to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from 67 to 93. And they've continued to do it from 93 to the present. But it was always slow. It was always through administrative fiat, in arcane bureaucratic rules and regulations. Oh, they left the country for 3 years. Oh, they can't come back. Oh, we're going to ethnically cleanse them from this area to that area. We're going to make their life miserable, and eventually they'll want to leave on their own. Oh, we're going to make Gaza unlivable, so they'll just get on a boat and go to Egypt or sneak under a tunnel and leave. Oh, we're going to force them out of Jerusalem so they can't live in Jerusalem. Maybe they'll just go to Jordan. So we're going to slowly make it hard on them, make it tough on them, make their life miserable, checkpoints, property confiscation, destruction of olive groves, curfews, right? We're going to make their lives miserable, and they'll just want to leave on their own. And if you ask Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank and in Israel proper, that's what most of them will tell you. Just get me the hell out of here. I give up. So that was the goal, but it was gradual and it was slow. And so it wasn't really obvious to many, many Jews and many Jewish Americans what was happening. But since October 7th, we don't need to theorize. We don't need an academic to tell us that settler colonial movements inevitably lead to genocide and annihilation. We can watch it on our phones. It's being live streamed 24/7, 365 for 700 days. We can see Zionism in real time. We can see that Zionism is resulting in exactly what the academics predicted. It's resulting in genocide, just like it resulted in genocide everywhere else. And now that we can see it in real time, live streamed, we're being woken up as a community. I mean, those of us who have been following Zionism for a long time have known this for a long time. But those of us who are not following things closely have woken up. And so you're seeing a hockey stick-like growth in Jewish anti-Zionism, Jewish anti-Zionist organization. JVP has organized some of the largest protests, right? Taking over the Rotunda, taking over Capitol Hill, taking over the San Francisco Bay Bridge, taking over train stations and Penn Station, right? They're the most vocal, the loudest, the largest anti-Zionist organization, Jewish or non-Jewish, in the United States today. So this is what has happened among Jews in the United States, especially since October 7th.
So what's the status of the anti-Zionist movement within the Israeli Jewish community, such as it is?
Well, the Israeli government it tries, although mostly fails, to have an influence on Jewish Americans, right? It doesn't have control over us. It can't imprison us. It can try and silence us. It can call us anti-Semites, but ultimately they have minimal influence, let's say, on the average American Jew. Now, that's just not the case in Israel, right? In Israel, if you're an anti-Zionist Jew, you will be harassed, you will be intimidated, you will be arrested, you will be silenced. Jonathan Pollock, perhaps the most outspoken of all the anti-Zionist Jews in Israel today, when he was arrested in Beiteh in the northern West Bank for protesting Israel's annexation policies and its belligerent military occupation, he demanded that he be treated like any other Palestinian who's arrested is treated. That is to say, he demanded that he be administratively detained, because that is exactly what happens to all the Palestinians who are arrested, who are protesting side by side him. And so he's arrested and imprisoned. And Andre X, another Jewish anti-Zionist in Israel, he's constantly arrested. He's constantly facing legal proceedings for this, that, or the other ridiculous charge, right? I mean, he's a nonviolent protester. The guy has never picked up a stone in his life and thrown it at anybody. He's an activist. He's a nonviolent activist. Of course, they're arresting him. He's constantly in and out of court. What happened to Ilan Pappé? They pushed him out of the country altogether. They after he oversaw a master's thesis, I think by a guy named Teddy Kolak in the late 90s, who wrote a master's thesis on, no, that's not his name. His name is escaping me. Who wrote a master's thesis on the Tantura massacre, in which he went around and interviewed all these Zionist militia members who carried out the massacre and admitted they did it. He published a thesis. He got he got attacked by the Israeli academia for supervising that thesis. And eventually, as Ilan Pappé explains, he was pushed out of Israeli academia altogether. And he's obviously perhaps the most prominent Jewish anti-Zionist of them all. So if you're a Jewish anti-Zionist in Israel, the Israeli government will do everything in its power to push you out of the country, to silence your voice, to demonize you, to marginalize you. I mean, this is the case with virtually all outspoken Jewish anti-Zionists in Israel.
And I should probably point out also that while the government of Israel has limited reach in being able to, seek legal recourse against Americans who speak out, it's pretty effective at controlling the political discourse through its various lobbying arms, right? I mean, that definitely needs to be pointed out.
Yeah, fair point. That's a great point. Obviously, what I meant to say was they don't have any ability to coerce us through force, through the use of violence, right? Yes. Yeah. But of course, you're absolutely correct. I mean, in terms of soft power influence,
our politicians look like they're deers caught in the headlights, or like they're in a hostage video every time Israel does something that is awkward for them to have to comment on. Whenever in front of a camera, it's like they just sound like robots. They're reading from a script. All agency seems to just leave their bodies. So I'm telling you what you obviously know far, far better than I do, but it just bears mentioning.
Absolutely.
So last question. And I asked this as a closed question, so please indulge me and provide a little bit more than a yes or no, if you don't mind.
Sure.
But is it possible to bring about an end to the Israeli apartheid state and a just outcome for Palestinians while preserving any elements of Zionist ideology?
It's a fascinating question, because I do mean this. Zionism is not a static ideology. It evolves, and its leaders evolve, and the opinions of the people who embrace the ideology evolve. And you might have said maybe in the 1970s, or maybe the early 1990s, maybe there was something salvageable in the sense that, okay, Zionism is going to lead to discrimination for Palestinians, but it's not going to lead to ethnic cleansing and genocide automatically, right? Maybe they could have said, we'll let back the refugees, they can return. Maybe the Zionist movement could have said, we'll end the occupation. Maybe the Zionist movement could have said, right, we'll open up the 900 Jewish-only communities in Israel to non-Jews. It didn't have to wind up the way it wound up, right? But that's just the history of Zionism that we've witnessed, the history of the state of Israel that we've all been witnessing and experiencing, again, with very few exceptions, with very few moments of exception. The movement and the country and its leaders and its military and its philosophy and its military doctrine that we've all been witnessing over the past many, many decades only points in one direction, which is that the ideology is it's unsalvable. It's unsavable. I just don't know a world in which a state of Israel that embraces a Zionist ideology that says we need a state for Jews, that says Jews need to have extra rights and privileges. I don't know how that's ever going to be compatible with a state that treats all of its citizens equally, with a state that doesn't belligerently militarily occupy millions and millions of Palestinians, with a state that doesn't belligerently attack all of its neighbors
Yeah.
and occupy Lebanon and Syria and start wars with Iran and Yemen and assassinate prime ministers of other countries in Yemen. But the Zionist movement has gotten to a point where it's no longer savable. And I really do think the sooner we can teach people and educate people that Zionism is a toxic ideology, especially the way it's been implemented and practiced over the past many decades, the sooner we're going to realize liberation for Palestinians, and the sooner we're going to bring an end to the genocide and the occupation and the apartheid and the violence that we've been witnessing for so many years.
Zachary, thank you for taking time to educate me on that note, and also our audience on these topics, so that we can try and figure out, a way to unstick ourselves from this, at least when it comes to the U.S., this marriage we have with settler colonial genocidal ideology.
Just want to say thank you so much for hosting me, and happy to come back anytime.
All right, man. And I will take you up on that, and say hi to Mexico City for me, man. I miss tacos and I miss everything about it.
Absolutely. Will do, Eric. Miss you too, buddy. Take care.
All right. Talk to you later, bro.
Cheers.
Thank you for coming back. I usually don't do this, but I felt like it would have been a pretty glaring omission if I had overlooked this element of our discussion. So thanks for making time. Really appreciate it.
Of course.
So let's jump right into it. Given its secular origins, as we discussed in the very beginning of our conversation, and early opposition from the religious Jewish community, why does Zionism and settler activity in Palestine now seem to have such a strong religious characteristics? For example, we've got Ben Gvir, we've got the Hilltop Youth, we've got Smotrich.
There are many reasons why the ultra-Orthodox community, or let's just say the Orthodox Jews of Europe, in the United States, and elsewhere, shifted from an avowedly anti-Zionist position that they held, let's say, before World War I, to an increasingly non-Zionist and then even Zionist position after 1948. So what led to that transition? I would say the first thing that happened was the Zionist community was extremely hostile to the ultra-Orthodox Jews who rejected Zionism. And in fact, the very first victim, you could say, of the Zionist movement was the leader of the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist Jews in Palestine in the 1920s. And his name was Jacob Israel Dahan. He migrated to Palestine. He was an ultra-Orthodox Jew, and he represented the anti-Zionist bloc in Palestine in the 19-teens and 20s. And so what did Israel do to Jacob Israel Dahan, the Jewish anti-Zionist leader in Palestine? They murdered him. The Haganah, which at the time was a militia, an underground militia, and it was led by the Zionist community. You could say it was the mainstream Zionist militia. They murdered him. And he was really the spokesperson of that community. And when he was murdered, there was really no one to replace him. And so the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist Jews in Palestine were sidelined. In Europe, the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist Jews were mostly annihilated. You had many, many hundreds of thousands of Jews who belonged to the Agudat Yisrael bloc. These were the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Eastern Europe, primarily in the Pale Settlement, places like Poland, Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, the Russian Empire, and so on. And they were annihilated. And then
Was this during the Holocaust, or
this is during the
prior?
Holocaust, from 1939 to 1945. The Nazis murdered 6 million Jews, including the vast majority of the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Eastern Europe.
Okay, I have to interject, if I can, a follow-up question to that, because is that just coincidental, or was this part of the conversation that's going on between the Zionist, secular Zionist Ashkenazi community in Europe and the Third Reich, and their interest in preserving their own interest as far as who's immigrating to Palestine?
There were many Zionists in Europe who collaborated with the Nazis. The Zionist leader, I believe, I don't want to get the the country wrong here, but was it Hungary? Basically collaborated with the Nazis, telling the Jews, you're gonna be relocated to a safer place, and they were shipped off to the gas chambers. So the Zionist community was very much the community of Jews that was most likely to collaborate with the Nazis, and this was the case before the Holocaust, and this was the case during the Holocaust. You
You
even
had the
had
Havara Agreement too. Is that something we should get into at all?
so in 1933. The Zionist community signed what at the time was a secret agreement with the Nazis, known as the Ha'avara Agreement or the Transfer Agreement, in which German Jews would be allowed to transfer some percentage of their assets over to Palestine so long as they bought German manufactured goods, right? So, the whole idea was that the Zionists wanted to help these Jews in Germany leave Germany, move to Palestine. This was great for the Nazis as well because they wanted to rid Germany of all those filthy Jews. So there was an alignment of interests. But the condition for migration was that you had to prop up the German economy, that same German economy that was struggling after the Germans had been forced to pay reparations after World War I. And so the Zionist community was the only real Jewish community in the entire world to be supporting the Germans after the rise of Hitler. You recall that most Jewish communities around the world were horrified when Hitler came to power in Germany in 1933. In fact, you had a spontaneous boycott of Germany around the world among Jewish communities. And Jews were horrified, and they wanted to. There was a kind of a spontaneous, leaderless boycott of German goods, and the Jews that broke the boycott were, of course, the Zionists because they had shared interests with the Nazis.
So was there infighting between the Jewish community in Germany over this issue, over the Havara Agreement?
Oh, absolutely. You could say that this was the key issue dividing the Jewish community in Germany as well as in the United States. It caused a tremendous amount of uproar in the Jewish community. They were outraged. The anti-Zionist and non-Jewish and non-Zionist Jews were outraged at what the Zionists were doing. They were propping up the regime that was the most anti-Semitic regime in all of human history.
So please correct me. I'm gonna maybe bring us forward a bit too. I know that I'm kind of jumping all over the place as far as timelines, and pull me back to whatever spot in the timeline you'd like to, if you think it's necessary for context. But we've established in a sense that there's kind of this social engineering project, not kind of, there is a social engineering project taking place by the Ashkenazi Jewish Zionist community, obviously in Europe, as far as facilitating the migration of their particular kind of Jewish person, if I can put it crudely, right? And so bringing us maybe to after the Holocaust, and I mean, my view of Israel until recently, its history post 48, is that it was kind of this secular socialist, like its view of itself was as this kind of secular socialist utopia for Jewish people, right?
Yeah.
And so how do we square that? If that project, right, to socially engineer the nascent Zionist state as this secular, left-ish leaning utopian state for the Jewish diaspora, if that was successful to some degree, then when did the religious Jewish community show up and start playing the role in Israeli politics that we're now seeing people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir playing?
Yeah. Well, you could say the origin story of these people like Smotrich, like Ben-Gvir, is the national religious bloc, this modern Orthodox bloc. That's how it's known in English. In Hebrew, it's called Dati Leumi, national religious. These are basically people who identify as both religious and Zionist. And the origin story of these people, you could say, is Rav Kook, who was the chief rabbi of Palestine under the Mandate. And he was a pretty radical theologian in the sense that he really transformed the traditional concept of exile and return. This idea that Jews are supposed to wait for the Messiah, that any action taken by human beings to try to pull forward that messianic future, that would be a sin, and that's a heresy. That was the traditional view. And Rav Kook flipped it on its head. He actually said that by that the human beings could in fact instigate God. They could wake God up. This was kind of the thinking. It was a pretty radical theological point of view, but what it did was it provided the religious Jews who were inclined towards Zionism, kind of a religious cover story, a theological excuse to pursue their religious, nationalist, fascistic agenda, which, especially after 1967, it came to play a more and more important role in Israeli society. Before 1967, Israel was a pretty secular society. But what happened after 67 was, and recall 67 was the year in which Israel conquered the West Bank, it conquered Jerusalem, it conquered Gaza, the Golan Heights, Sinai. Jews thought this was a miracle, right? It was a miraculous victory. The little Jewish state conquered all of this territory. It was perceived to be a kind of a divine intervention. You even have religious communities around the world that say an extra prayer in the prayer service. We're talking about the prayer service that dates back 1,500 years. They would add a new prayer to celebrate the conquest of Jerusalem, which was again perceived to be this miraculous conquest. Here, after thousands of years, the Jews finally have control over all of these Jewish holy sites. I mean, recall Israel before 67 did not control the Western Wall. They did not control the old city of Jerusalem. They did not control Hebron. They did not control Joseph's tomb near Nablus, right? All of these holy sites in the West Bank are now under Jewish control. So this was perceived to be some kind of miraculous military victory that is going to usher in a new era, the second coming, right? The Mashiach is on its way. And that was the thinking. And that's why these messianists gained more power and they gained larger numbers. They obviously have more kids than secular Israelis. So they're growing demographically, and they're increasingly, especially since the 1990s and 2000s, since the failure of Oslo, and after the failure of the secular left to bring about any change in the situation, the right gained prominence, especially the national right, especially that religious right. And so since, you could say, 2000, really, and especially since the Second Intifada, the religious right has gained more power and more influence in Israeli society.
I mean, looking at this as, I mean, I'll just go ahead and be open about my politics here for a moment. Like, as a self-identified leftist, I mean, we have something called accelerationism or vanguardism, if you're talking about like the Maoist or the Leninist approach to the implementation of communism, right? And this sounds like a spiritual iteration of that approach, right? That you have this notion, because even as I was raised in like an evangelical Christian church, like this, there's this notion that it's blasphemous to think that you can force God's hand, right?
Right.
But that is kind of like what the Leninist or Maoist approach to communism is, as I understand it. And we have that happening in like the spiritual space, as far as the Christian Zionist and Judeo-Zionist iterations of their approach to the end times and their own scripture. So I don't know if that's getting too much in the weeds, but yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's a sort of interventionist view. It's a view that Jews had rejected over the course of many millennia. And I think the reason is pretty obvious. When you're living under the rules and the laws and the whimsical fantasies of an emperor or of an autocrat or of even of a democratically elected leader, you're going to probably err on the side of quietism. And that was the view towards states in general over the course of many thousands of years. Jews were obviously this discriminated group. They had faced persecution. And so the attitude among most Jewish communities towards the powers that be was one of quietism. We're not going to be we're not going to, call for some Jewish state somewhere else. We're not going to try and take over the state we're living in. We're just going to sort of keep to ourselves so that we can follow the Torah laws and keep kosher and live in our own community and manage our own affairs. And that was the traditional view of the religious authorities, of the rabbinical authorities for millennia. And really, you could say the state's existence, the fact that you had here a state calling itself a Jewish state, all of whose leaders were Jewish, all of whose citizens were, the vast majority of whose citizens were Jewish. And so the religious community also felt a little bit empowered. They felt a little bit like, oh, we don't need to be quietists like we used to be. They embraced Zionism. I mean, effectively what happened is, now that you had a state, now that you had an army, now that you had this Jewish society, the Zionist community, as the religious community, effectively embraced Zionism for the same reason that Jews all around the world embraced Zionism. This seemed to be some kind of Jewish manifestation, Jewish self-determination, Jewish prosperity. They embraced all the propaganda that secular Jews embraced.
Last follow-up question, I'll let you go, man. Sorry, I just wanted to make sure I'm covering my bases here. So what is the animating engine of Zionism now that we're looking at it, kind of realizing its ultimate, expression as this authoritarian, totalitarian, genocidal apartheid project? Like, how much of this is now a religious project that's kind of taken over control? How much of it's a marriage between secular and religious ideology? How much of it's just like the rhetoric of religiosity, just providing more force to, because Bibi doesn't strike me as particularly religious, right?
No, he's not. He's quite secular.
So then where are we at? I mean, how much is he just having to recognize that the religious Zionists are kingmakers? And how much of it is like, actually, no, like for him to be able to do anything, he's maybe a somewhat charismatic figure within the context of Israeli politics, but like they really are the ones like in charge of they're the ones driving the vehicle. Where are we at with that?
Yeah, there's no question that the future of Israel is, there's no question that Israel will be a religious fanaticist state until it crumbles, until it collapses. I don't see any other way you get elected in Israeli society if you don't bring along the national religious bloc and the ultra-Orthodox religious bloc. You're talking about very important political parties in the state of Israel. I mean,
are they marginal political parties? Or are they essentially, the state? Are they the ones providing the mandate? Or are they just kingmakers?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, Israeli politics is tricky because you need 60. So the Israeli parliament is composed of 120 seats. So you need 61 seats to have a majority. And you could say the largest bloc for the past couple of years has been Likud, which is not explicitly religious, but is composed of many, if not a majority of religious people. But then you also have Smotrich's a party, and then you have Ben Gvir's party, and then you have the ultra-Orthodox parties, and then you have other parties that may not be religious, but they're just as fanatical in terms of their politics, right? Like, think of Naftali Bennett. I mean, he actually wears a kippah. He is national religious. And then you have Avigdor Lieberman, who's secular, but he's perhaps even more politically extreme than people like Netanyahu or people like Naftali Bennett. So where in Israel today is there a leader who represents something other than religious fanaticism? I mean, can you think of anyone who has any prospects of getting elected? I mean, you could say, Yair Golan. Yair Lapid. I mean, he's probably the closest thing you can find to some kind of secular Israeli leader. But even Yair Lapid, I mean, back when he was elected prime minister, was it a couple years ago when it was that brief period when Netanyahu was out of power, he had a power sharing agreement with Naftali Bennett, in which they declared 6 Palestinian NGOs terrorist organizations. This was in 2022.
I did my graduate internship with one of those, by the way, Defense for Children International. Yeah.
The Israeli left is calling human rights organizations terrorist organizations. There is no Israeli left anymore. Labor is gone. Meretz is gone. Standing Together is a very small bloc. The Arab, yes, you have Arab parties, but even those parties are pretty small, and you can easily form a coalition without them. So there is no longer an Israeli left. And the only hope, really, I think, that you have any kind of political movement in Israel that doesn't represent religious fanaticism or genocide is if you have an alliance between the Arab parties and whatever's left of the Israeli Jewish left. That's the only hope. And even then, you'll have a bloc that's still going to be smaller than Likud. It's still going to be smaller than all the religious and ultra-Orthodox parties.
And just because they're left doesn't mean they're not Zionist, right?
And they're obviously
if they're actually left, then sure. But I mean, insofar as I would define what left means, right? Anti-imperialist, etc.
There's probably less than 5,000 anti-Zionist Jews in Israel, in a country of 8-9 million Jews, right? So, there's
something to keep in mind when we see these protests, by the way, and what they're actually about, right? It's not about people suffering in Gaza, right?
For the first time in 2 years, there was a large anti-genocide protest in Tel Aviv. This was 2 weeks ago.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yes.
It was, but again, we're talking the very first one in literally 2 years. There was a protest in Sakhnin, which is an Arab village inside Israel. So the Palestinians who live in this village carry Israeli passports. There were about 20,000 people that came out to that protest in July. So that was the very first time Palestinians in Israel have been granted a permit to protest. It's not that they don't want to protest, it's that they're not allowed to. And if they protest without permission, they'll all be arrested and put in a torture dungeon where they face rape, starvation, and death. I mean, 60 Palestinian prisoners have been murdered since October 7th. So we're talking about a society that applies extreme pressure and extreme repression on anyone protesting genocide. But finally, now that the Israeli military is very hostile to Netanyahu's plans for Gaza because they don't have enough manpower and they're facing casualties every day, the army is against what Netanyahu is doing in North Gaza. The army wants a ceasefire. The Shin Bet wants a ceasefire. The Mossad wants a ceasefire. It's Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben Gvir that do not. So, so the reason you're now seeing these protests is because there's real tension within Israeli society, Jewish society, and there's elements within Israeli Jewish society that want to put pressure on Netanyahu, Smotrich, and Ben Gvir, and so now they're allowing these protests. And so you're starting to see an anti-genocide bloc develop, and they're even using the word genocide, and they're even talking about Palestinian children. And that's new. But we haven't seen that until relatively recently.
Okay, Zach, thanks again. I know it's not our last conversation, so I'll leave this one where it is. And thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Anytime, Eric. It's always a pleasure. Take care, buddy.